Let's stay with the developments around the UN Security Council. Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us live now, our correspondent who's been watching this particular story. Sherwin, of course, this is quite significant. Take us through what it all means.
Certainly a significant day in the United Nations Security Council, Bongiwe, and such was the anticipation ahead of this vote that when it eventually passed, given the history in this council of failure after failure after failure in relation to the Gaza file, 14 members voting in favor of this resolution, the United States abstained, and the room broke out into applause. The Security Council applauding itself, member states in the room applauding this move, given just what a landmark decision it has been in the context, Bongiwe, of so many failures. Let me tell you what this resolution does. It demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all the parties and leading to a more lasting, sustainable ceasefire. It also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all the hostages. You'll be aware that 130 plus hostages are still being held in different locations in Gaza by Hamas and other groups. And then it also emphasizes, Bongiwe, the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance and to reinforce the protection of civilians in the Gaza Strip, and reiterates its demand for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale and in line with international humanitarian law. We got a sense early on this weekend that this resolution might pass, of course, given the failure on Friday when China and Russia vetoed a US drafted resolution that talked about the need or the imperative for a ceasefire, but did not explicitly demand one immediately. This text, of course, is different, but the Secretary General speaking in Jordan over the week, in fact, earlier today, just talking about the growing international consensus around the Gaza file. This is what Antonio Guterres had to say. Watch.
I see a growing consensus emerging international community to tell the Israelis that the ceasefire is needed. And I also see a growing consensus. I heard it in the US, I heard it from the European Union, not to mention, of course, the Muslim world, a growing consensus to tell clearly to the Israelis that any ground invasion of Rafah could mean a catastrophic humanitarian disaster. And I strongly hope that this consensus that is emerging in the whole of the international community will make Israel reflect and avoid what could be a dramatic tragedy.
Bongiwe, the Secretary General, also on that trip visiting Egypt, where he went to the Rafah border crossing and he saw the lines of humanitarian trucks loaded with medical supplies, with food and water that is so desperately needed in Gaza. Looking at those lines of trucks while there was starvation happening across the border in Gaza, he called it a moral outrage. So it remains to be seen how far this resolution is going to go to change that calculus on the ground.
And I suppose, Sherwin, that's the big question, especially because a lot of people are looking for a lasting solution on this particular problem, and also hoping that all parties adhere to this latest development.
Well, that is the big question, right? The implementation of the resolution. There's a history of Israel ignoring legally binding resolutions, particularly on the expansion of settlements which are illegal under international law, but that continue to this day unabated despite the war in Gaza. So the big question is Israel going to implement this resolution? It very specifically calls for a stop to fighting for the month of Ramadan, leading to a sustainable or lasting ceasefire, Bongiwe. But even if in the best case scenario the guns were to stop, at least say for the remainder of the remaining 2 weeks of Ramadan, you then have to deal with getting that humanitarian aid into Gaza. The roads have been destroyed. Civilian infrastructure has been destroyed. Hospitals are operating on really at the very limits, right? We've heard from doctors in Gaza talking about how the health system in Gaza has essentially collapsed. Schools are not functioning. Kids are not going to school. And even if the 1.5 million people that are congregated in Rafah in the south want to move back to their homes in central Gaza or the north, there are no homes to go back to. So even if there's a ceasefire, there is so much work that still has to be done on the ground, even if the guns are silenced now for a number of weeks. It does not change the real difficulties that humanitarians are going to face on the ground in Gaza. There is a sense of lawlessness in Gaza. The structures of legality have fallen apart because society has fallen apart in Gaza. So even if you take that aid in, you've seen the desperate clamoring for people to get their hands on food and water if those trucks do go in. So who is going to provide the security? This, as many council members have intimated today after this vote, is merely the beginning of a process now that needs to unfold. So, you know, a lot of responsibility is going to rest on Israel's shoulders and also on Hamas's shoulders. They now have to release the 130 plus hostages. It's a key demand of this resolution. So clear priorities for both sides of this conflict moving forward.
And also showing, of course, much to be said about the United States abstaining.
Well, I think this is an indication of the growing pressure that has been on the United States. And you've seen the posture over the last number of weeks shift towards, you know, senior U.S. officials, including the U.S. ambassador here, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, talking about the need and the imperative for a humanitarian ceasefire. Their resolution might not have passed, but they did abstain today. And that really tells you, speaks to the frustration we are seeing between Washington and Israeli authorities, particularly as it relates to the planned ground offensive that the Israelis are adamant they are going to move ahead with in terms of that ground operation in Gaza, in Rafah, where some 1.5 million people displaced from other areas in Gaza have gone to seek shelter. And the United States has made it very clear, including at the highest levels, including the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, saying they do not support a ground operation in Gaza, that they believe it is the wrong move by the Israeli authorities, and they have invited a senior Israeli military delegation, including the Israeli defense minister, to Washington this week to engage them particularly on their intention to continue this operation in Gaza. The Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying they do not believe that that is the only way to dismantle any continued structures that Hamas might have in those regions, and that is what the discussions are going to be centered around in Washington this week between the senior Israeli military delegation and the United States. It wants to set clear parameters on how Israel moves forward with their military operations, given the massive toll we have seen inflicted on civilians in the enclave Bongwe.
Sherwin, thank you so much for that update.